If you look at journals like Nature Climate Change, you can see lots of experiments that have been published by social scientists trying to change people's opinions on climate change. Mostly they don't work. They have small effects. The effects don't last very long. That people's opinions are not easily changed in a way that our laboratory experiments can change undergraduates' opinions in labs briefly.
You just heard Jon Krosnick from Stanford University in Stanford, California. Eric interviewed Jon for episode 254 of Psych Sessions, Conversations about Teaching and Stuff.
As a listener of this podcast, you're already passionate about psychology, and Sage College Publishing helps you bring that passion into the classroom. Sage is an independent publisher focused on the social sciences. Beyond leading psychology research journals, Sage has deep roots in the discipline and offers textbooks across the entire major, from intro psych to brain and behavior, and from child development to research methods. Sage also offers Vantage, an intuitive learning platform recommended by 9 out of 10 instructors who have used it. It integrates with your LMS, it's easy to set up, simple to use, so that you can focus on teaching, not troubleshooting. So check out what Sage College Publishing has to offer at psychsessions.org/sage and let them be your partner in teaching the science of being human.
Hi, my name is Drew Christopher. I joined SDP back in 1996 because I just wanted to be a better teacher, and I figured something called the Society for the Teaching of Psychology would help me in that regard, and it did. I became involved in a variety of task force, a variety of working groups, and so forth early on in my career. And looking back on it now, I think one of the biggest benefits wasn't just becoming a better teacher, but all the colleagues that I met along the way, and I'm still friends with today, who are also helping me still be a good teacher, if not a great teacher. Those professional connections have lasted a lifetime, and both personally and professionally, they're probably one of the most rewarding things that I can look back on the over 30 years I've been teaching and say it's probably the best thing I've ever done.
To join the Society for the Teaching of Psychology for only $35 a year, please visit teachpsych.org. APA Publishing wants to give you 15% off your order. If you teach classes like counseling, clinical psychopathology, or multicultural psychology, then this is for you. APA Publishing has books that are written by experts that are grounded in evidence and really help teachers. I'll give you a couple of examples. There's a book they have right now called Helping Skills. It's in its 6th edition, and it gives students clear, practical frameworks for understanding and learning counseling techniques. It's perfect for hands-on practice and skill development. Here's another one. Cultural Humility helps students build self-awareness and engage meaningfully across diverse identities and experiences. So head to apa.org because they want to give you 15% off your order today using code PS15. That's capital P, capital S, 15. Go check out APA Publishing.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Psych Sessions, Conversations about Teaching and Stuff. I am completely thrilled today to be talking to the renowned Jon Krosnick from Stanford University. Both, we can talk about the number of cross appointments he has in a moment, but he's in psychology, he's in political science. Hi, Jon, how are you?
Good to see you, Eric. Thank you very much for having me.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And so, it's interesting that when we look at each other's websites or we look at the signatures on emails, you see all the things that are underneath the email signature. So did I at least start correctly with political science and psychology?
That's a good beginning. There's more.
And what did I leave out?
Well, communication is another one. And the newest one is environmental social sciences.
Environmental social sciences. Will you please take a moment and tell our listeners what that means? And me too, because I don't know.
I will. Well, Stanford as a university, and I think many universities are increasingly thinking this way, value not just the teaching experience on campus, but the teaching experience off campus as well. And that, frankly, universities are feeling more and more pressure to make it clear not only that we are helping our students to grow and to become great professionals, but also to help the world solve pressing problems. Because let's face it, we got plenty of pressing problems. And so one of the most exciting institutional developments at our university is, I gather, the second largest single gift to any university at the time in the history of gifts to universities, that I think it was 1.3 or 1.4 billion dollars to create a new school of sustainability. And this is, of course, in response to the growing passion and enthusiasm that our generation of students currently have for issues of environmental sustainability. And, we had a School of Earth and we had other programs that, like many other universities have, but this was a real commitment to build new physical space, to recruit 60 new faculty, and to really expand the curriculum. And happily, we have a Department of Environmental Social Sciences to complement the engineers and the physical scientists, because, I think we would agree that an engineer can come up with some great, clever solution to a problem, but if people are not willing to use it or change their behavior accordingly, then not a lot gets accomplished. So that's the logic there.
So I just want to make sure I heard you clearly. You received a grant for $1.3 billion with a B dollars. Is that right?
This was a gift from a private donor.
Oh, okay. Okay. And you were able to hire 60 full-time faculty?
That's so the goal was to ramp up as quickly as possible. We are in the midst of doing that. We're hiring as many people as we can as quickly as we can. But in each of the fields that we advertise in, there are only so many people on the job market at a time, and so it's going to take a little while to get up to that place. But luckily, it's going to take a while to build the building for everybody to be in, also. So it'll
right. I just I've been a part of very small grants where I was a co-PI on like a $2 million grant. I know you said it was a gift, that wasn't a grant, but just it boggles me to think about how would anyone manage a $1.3 billion budget. Yeah,
I mean, it's like creating a little university within a university.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, you're your own unit, with your own funding, and so I'm sorry, I'm so curious about this. Were people just clamoring to be a part of this, or were some of your colleagues on campus? Well, that's the new upstart, and whatever. We'll wait and see. What was the tone or the mood around this amazing thing?
Well, I think the real motivator for faculty who are on campus already to get involved in this operation is passionate commitment to the theme and the focus of the school. And so for me personally, as you know, I've been doing 25 years of very expensive, high quality national surveys exploring the psychology of Americans' opinions about climate change. And so I kind of felt like, how could I not be linked there? And the 20 to 25 colleagues who are in the environmental social science department with me already also had been doing research that somehow touches on this issue in many ways. And so I think some of us just felt like we had no choice but to become involved. But, if you want to get in the weeds a little bit, some people moved their salaries entirely over to the new school. And I'm a person who didn't move any salary over to the new school. But I have such poor judgment, but I'm going to all the faculty meetings and all the job talks and, all the colloquia and trying to be a good citizen over there as much as I can amidst all the other faculty meetings I got to go to and everything else. So I think it's true that we were all drawn to it, but it does add to the burden. Like nobody gives us release from some other thing in order to do this.
Right.
And so it is extra. You have to really believe in it and find it valuable. And when folks join a social psychology faculty, for example, when you walk in that first faculty meeting with your new colleagues, you all share a common background of core literature, research methods, and goals. And when you create a department of environmental social social scientists that includes not just psychologists, but sociologists and political scientists and anthropologists and people from law schools and historians, and that there isn't that common ground yet. And so we've had to build that as part of the process, getting to know each other and evolving. We're still in the process of evolving a core set of standards to really answer the question, what, if somebody gets a PhD in environmental social sciences, what do they need to know? What are the core issues to understand? Whereas that's easy in social psychology. It's just much harder when you're creating an interdisciplinary program like this.
So, Jon, forgive this question, and I'm happy to edit out anything that you want. So please trust me on that. Do you have a hard time saying no?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. I should get therapy for sure.
Well, I am not qualified to make that judgment, not at all. But it sounds like, from what I read on your website, what you shared with me in an email, just the first 6 minutes of our conversation here, you have a lot of irons in the fire.
I've begun my therapy already. This is great. Good. Thank you.
Well, okay. Well, I don't have any solutions for you. I do tell my colleagues, especially my junior colleagues who will listen, the more often you say no to things, that frees you to say yes to things you really want to do. So, but I mean, 4 cross appointments, running a new program on campus, and all the work you've been doing in survey design, public opinion polling. I want to try to get to all of it as well as we can. What's the thing that's on the front burner for you right now of all the things you're juggling?
Well, the other really exciting thing that has happened at Stanford is the university's decision to create the Stanford Institute for Excellence in Survey Research, which we affectionately call CSER, SIESR.
Okay.
And in a way, this is a culmination of, a life dream for me that when I was in grad school, I learned quickly about embarrassing cases of researchers who did a really interesting work, but it turns out that by virtue of not being as attentive to details of research methods as they should have been, unfortunately, the work got undermined and devalued. So and one of the best examples, unfortunately, is the book called The Authoritarian Personality that 4 psychologists at Berkeley published many decades ago. And I hope that all of your listeners by now know that unfortunately the battery of questions that those researchers used to identify people with an authoritarian personality were written in a way with agree, disagree rating scales as the answer choices. And it turns out that the only way to score as an authoritarian was to agree with all the statements in the battery. And later, very smart social psychologists pointed out that actually there's a problem here because you're confounding authoritarian personalities with personalities that tend to acquiesce, people who choose to agree with anything no matter what. And huge literature has developed in psychology and related fields documenting that. And so unfortunately, this big fat book that these very smart psychologists wrote ends up having to be kindling in a fireplace because none of the data were interpretable or rescuable after the fact. And I said, I don't want to be that person. And so I got interested in the details of research methods, whether it's how to word questions in questionnaires or how to select samples of participants to study. And I just got addicted to that line of work. So one part of what I do is the psychology of attitudes, especially in the arena of politics. And the other stream of what I do is research method stuff. And I have to admit to you that I feel a little bit gratified by that because finally and I certainly would never have wished this, but the replication crisis that exploded 15 or so years ago, I think really has called attention to the fact that we all have to be, as a field, much less trusting of ourselves and of others, and more meticulous in how we do and document our work. And I kind of have always been feeling that. So I feel a little gratified that that awareness has come to my perspective.
You mentioned the graduate school experience and getting exposed to survey research. That was at Michigan, correct? At
Michigan, yes.
So, and I don't know the exact timelines about the question I'm about to ask. Did you overlap at all when you were a grad student at Michigan with Bill McKeechee?
Bill was around, but I didn't interact with him. When I went to Michigan, it was an amazing place because the social psychology program was housed in the Institute for Social Research, and what that meant was in this big building, we were, right next to sociologists, economists, political scientists, and others. And survey research was a common method being used by lots of people. Jackie Eccles is an example of a psychologist who was in the program doing big surveys of students, and others in social psychology were also doing surveys, although Bob Zients and Hazel Marcus and Dick Nisbet and others were happily being super productive in lab settings. And so I got exposed to these multiple methods as a part of that hothouse.
So I think you'll appreciate this tidbit of trivia. I got to know Bill McKeachie a little bit. I got to interview him and write some book chapters about him. His first year at Michigan as a student was Rensis Lickert's last year at Michigan. And Bill McKeachie knew Rensis Lickert. And even though the rest of us in the world called the Likert scale, Bill told me his last name was Lickert. So
thank you for saying it correctly. All of us who were at Michigan at the time learned that, and I've spent half my life correcting people's pronunciation. Just out of respect.
With my students, I still call it the Likert scale, but I can also tell them the real pronunciation is Lickert.
Yeah. No, that's all I say. And I got to know his daughter actually over the years as well, who is, a really delightful person. And so I respect the way they wanted to say their name, and so I say it.
Yeah, absolutely. So. As long as we've hearkened back to undergrad, again, I trust me, I'm going to get to all the stuff about opinion strength and name order on ballots and the replication, survey satisficing. I've got all my notes here. But Jon, can we go? So here's one of my favorite questions to ask. When you were growing up as a kid, as a young man, was the question in your home, will you go to college, or was the question, what college will you go to?
There was no doubt that I would go to college. That was never a question.
And had your mother or father gone to college?
They both went to college. They met as undergraduates at Temple University, and my dad was a physician and also went to Temple Medical School. And it turns out my dad, I kind of didn't I think many of us don't appreciate this when we're kids, but he was a superstar. I just thought he was like a guy. He was my dad. But there were all these plaques around the house of these awards that he had gotten, which I got so used to them, I didn't think much of them. But the older I got, the more I realized, my God, who this man was. It wasn't drummed into me that he was who he was, but it was the kind of thing. He was significant in two ways. Number one, just as a practitioner, we couldn't go to the grocery store without somebody coming up to him and saying, "Dr. Krosnick, wonderful to see you. You took care of my mother," or whatever. That kind of personal connection to his community. But also, he was a professor at Rutgers and had connections to research projects worldwide, and so he was a journal editor. So he was kind of a multifaceted. But maybe he had trouble saying no too. So that he was a model, and certainly higher education was for sure a part of my life.
Yeah, it sounds like it's in your family DNA for sure.
Yeah. I just did what I had to do. It wasn't something I had to think through.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Obviously different fields. Excuse me. Obviously different fields, but the level of renown and accomplishment sounds pretty parallel between you and your father.
Well, it's nice of you to say that. I certainly, I will never forget. As an undergraduate at Harvard, I went to Harvard as an undergrad thinking I just I didn't know anything other than being my dad. So I thought I was going to go be a physician, even though I wasn't really thrilled about medicine. I'd spent plenty of time in hospitals with him and seeing that experience of patient care, and it didn't really resonate with me. And luckily, my first semester at Harvard, I got introduced to social psychology, and Tom Pettigrew in particular. Don't ask me why I picked that class, but I immediately fell in love with it, dropped the whole whole pre-med thing and went running down the pathway of social science. And I can tell you that I don't think this would happen for any of today's students, but at that time, I think my mother in particular was horrified. Like, what psychology, social, what even is this? And if you can imagine it, my parents actually got on a plane and flew to Boston without me knowing and met with a bunch of faculty at Harvard to just try to find out what was this, what was going on here, and was this a viable profession in any way? And I think it's easily tied to the fact that generation, when they went to college, there was no quantitative social science for them to learn in the classroom. Maybe they heard about Sigmund Freud, but there really was that what we have as a modern science didn't exist, and so it's understandable that they didn't understand what the field was about. And what I fell in love with was the idea that we could use scientific methods, especially experimentation, and high-tech quantitative tools to understand the human mind and the social experience. And I do remember after this visit, and my parents were sort of converted, my dad was very happy that he had gotten a meeting with B.F. Skinner. Don't ask me how they did that, but somehow they got time with him and ended up thinking, okay, maybe this is viable. But to tell you the truth, Eric, the moment when I think my mother finally decided that what I was doing was acceptable was, decades later, when some friend of hers said, Evelyn, I saw your son has an op-ed in the New York Times today. That was like, that's what it took to be legit.
Isn't that great? And so I need to go back and deconstruct a couple of things. So did you grow up in the Philadelphia area?
I did. Morrisville, Pennsylvania is northeast of Philadelphia, just by Trenton, New Jersey, and that's where I spent most of my growing up.
Okay, and so that's why Trenton was so close for your dad to work at Rutgers. So, but they're all relatively near one another. What an amazing story that your parents get on a plane and fly to Boston, go to Harvard, and vet your future for you, and at the same time meet B.F. Skinner.
Yeah, it was an amazing thing. I'm glad that Harvard performed well in their audition of social sciences. But the reality was I was so in love with this field. It didn't really matter whether my parents were on board or not. I was going to do it. Yeah,
but it makes it a lot easier when the parents are on board.
That's for sure, when they're paying tuition, especially.
Yeah, and back in our day, going to grad school, it was when you got a check in the mail. There was no Venmo. There was, hey, I got a check from mom and dad. I'm cashing this immediately, kind of. At least for me, that's what it was like.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. Oh, I completely depended on that too. Exactly.
Yeah, that's great. So, and Jon, some of the names you've mentioned, I'm not a social psychologist by training, but I grew up going to MPA in Chicago, and it was really clear as a grad student and as a new faculty member that the Midwest was the bastion of social psychology. And, some of those names that you've already mentioned, and I think of Ohio State and Richard Petty and all those folks. I mean, you were in the hot. You fortunately stepped into the hotbed of social psych, didn't you?
Well, it was the second time that I fortunately stepped into a hotbed, because when I went to Harvard, just a function of my age, that psychology department was on fire. So, Dave Kenny and Susan Fisk and Shelley Taylor and Chick Judd and Freed Bales and Roger Brown and Robert Rosenthal and a huge group of people. Yeah. Some grad students. Steve Pinker, I think, was a grad student at the time. Okay. They're just an amazing place to be. You just couldn't walk in the halls without feeling the electricity of the place. So that was really easy to be inspired by as an undergrad. And then Chick Judd was my mentor as an undergrad, and he said, for what you want to do, you got to go to Michigan. And so that was an easy choice, because that place also, there were just so many social psychologists, not just in the psychology department, but in other departments on campus as well. And it was such an open, interdisciplinary approach that was taken taken by all of them. And then I was lucky to get a job at Ohio State. I didn't think I was lucky, but it's funny you should mention MPA, because Ohio State social psych is very, very dedicated to going to MPA every year. And that turned out to be a really great place for me to present my work, for my students to present their work, but more importantly, again, to feel like a part of this intellectual family in the region. And as you know, I don't need to tell you that MPA attracts people not in the Midwest also. That's how good a conference it is.
Yeah, I mean, there are people from around the world that travel to go to MPA, and MPA isn't limited by its Midwestern label, like you just said, and plus, I started my first MPA I was an undergraduate, it was 1985, and there was, for me, there, to this day, maybe there's nothing more impressive than taking that escalator up from the ground floor and seeing the Palmer House and seeing the majesty of that place, and then get to go to talks by all these people that I later on figured out, are legends in psychology, most of them in social psych, but others outside of social psych. And so, MPA was my home conference for a couple decades, for sure.
Yeah, for good reason.
Yeah, absolutely. So so was your first job after graduate school at Ohio State?
It was. And I went to Ohio State just as Tony Greenwald was leaving, as Bibb Latané was leaving. And, the Ohio State program had a very strong reputation historically, but it was kind of in a lull at that moment. And I was very lucky because I was coming out of grad school, I was incredibly confused. I had worked in such interdisciplinary ways that I applied for faculty jobs in psychology, sociology, political science, and communication. And I got interviews in all four of those fields.
Of course you did.
Just, by the end of the interviews, I realized that I'm a psychologist. I don't fit in these other fields. And, so I'm a professor of political science now, a professor of communication, but at my core, I'm a social psychologist. And so then it was easy to pick Ohio State. And amazingly, as you already alluded to, we hired Rich Petty, we hired John Cacioppo, we hired, various other people to grow the program, Bill Von Hippel. And it again became a large, vibrant program that the university was really proud of. Ohio State really wanted to climb in the national rankings of universities. And so they couldn't help but notice that there were a few programs on campus that already were top programs, and that was one of them.
When you interviewed at Ohio State for and you got 4 interviews, did the other 3 know about each other? Did they all know about each other? And did you do it on one trip, or did you make 4 separate trips? I'm sorry.
Well,
I've never heard of anybody doing this.
Yeah, no, I did one interview at Ohio State in psychology, and then the others, like I interviewed in sociology at Yale and Princeton, and at other departments. Communication was at USC. So I didn't.
It wasn't 4 departments at Ohio State.
Yeah, no, just 4
I
fields.
Misunderstood.
Yeah, 4 fields across the market.
Oh, but that's fascinating. That in and of itself, that's fascinating. And then I'm assuming tenure track assistant professor at Ohio State. And then how long were you at Ohio State?
18 years. So, we loved being there. Not only was it amazing in terms of the social psychology program growing and attracting just the best students, but also the political science program got increasingly strong, and I was very tightly connected with them. And a woman named Peg Herman was the creator of political psychology as a subfield in part. She was there. And so she really encouraged this, my participation in all that, including we co-created the Summer Institute for Political Psychology that lasted for decades. And so it was really a great place to be, and it was a great place to raise our daughter. And I have a second life as a professional jazz drummer in Ohio. Turns out to be a really good place to have a jazz group. I don't think we would.
I'm writing that down so I don't forget.
All right. I don't think we would have gone anywhere except for one little surprise that came from the West Coast.
So 18 years at Ohio State, you must obviously had been promoted with tenure. You were a full professor, but 18 years into your career. And so what did lure you to Stanford?
Well, honestly, as I was coming up as an undergrad and a grad student, various of my mentors, Chick Judd at Harvard, Howard Schuman at Michigan, Don Kinder, who was chair of my dissertation at Michigan. They all talked about an amazing sabbatical year that they spent at Stanford at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, CASBS. And I actually came out and visited Don when he was there as a fellow. And CASBS is just an amazing place. It's up on a hill looking down on the Stanford campus. It's got about 50 offices, a library, a dining room. And the idea is that 50 fellows from across the social sciences are invited to spend a responsibility-free year there. Back in the old days, you had to get nominated. It was kind of an old boys and girls network, and now it's a more open application process. But there's the idea is just to pick people who, if you put them somewhere for a year, and have them interact across disciplines, that it can be a productive experience. And when you go to the CASBS library and you look on the wall of all of the super famous books that were written there, you realize what a significant resume the institution has. So, I hoped that I would be invited to spend a year there, and sure enough, we were. And so my wife and I and our little daughter came out to California for a year, and within 2 months, I realized, oh my God, California is fabulous. I would love to be here, and started even to look at what faculty jobs might be open in California. But we really felt like, Stanford would be the place we wanted to be, but they would never have us. And then a few years later, happily, they showed us they were interested.
Do you think anyone at Stanford at that center realizes that year-long experience is a recruitment tool?
Oh, trust me, that is very, very, very well known. In fact, it's the reason that Stanford actually took it over, that it has for a very long time. I think this is approximately right. Stanford was renting the land for CASBS to CASBS for $1 a year, something like that. And CASBS was kind of financially separate. And it did fine. It got support from the Ford Foundation, from other major foundations, and from the National Science Foundation, and it was doing okay. But then as the years went on, it became more challenging to keep the doors open financially. And it became clear to Stanford that they couldn't afford to let this thing die because it was a recruitment tool. And, not to mention the amazing work that was done there.
Right.
So Stanford now owns it and runs it. And so there are plenty of Stanford faculty who go each year, but many, many more people who are not part of the Stanford faculty who are there.
Yeah. It's like a sabbatical plus or a sabbatical ultra. Literally it wasn't that you went off, you got to move your family out. Yeah. And you got to be not only with people from your own discipline, but from multiple disciplines and leaders, I'm going to guess, from around the world who would come there and spend a year there. And you had, I would imagine you built relationships and you had a cohort that probably is strong to this day, at least for some of those folks.
Absolutely. The other social psychologists who were there were Dan Wegner and Jerry Clore. And we remain friendly to today. Dan unfortunately passed away some years ago, but it just so happened that he and his wife and they had a little daughter who was almost exactly the same age as our daughter, ended up really bonding that year. And you're absolutely right. It was a lifelong friendship that we created with Tony Wegner, his wife, and that was really important. But honestly, Eric, the more important part of the year for me was the people outside my field. And I'll tell you just a quick story that illustrates how powerful this was. So we had only 2 requirements during that year as fellows. Number one was we needed to come to lunch and sit with different people and chat. But number 2 was we had to attend the Tuesday afternoon colloquia. And so each visiting fellow gave a talk. So by the time it was time for me to give a talk, I was pretty intimidated by the whole thing. Lots of people were much older than me and in lots of different fields. And I thought, okay, here's how I'm going to do this. And I decided to do, rather than an in-depth talk on one study or set of studies on one topic, I decided to do a smorgasbord of, I think, 4 or 5 different research programs, a little bit on each. And one of them was a study of subliminal conditioning of attitudes. And this is something that we published in, I think, PSPB. And what we had done was this was an outgrowth of being at Michigan at the time that Bob Zients was on the faculty when we were grad students. We three of us, two other grad students and I, Lee Jessam being one of them, came up as Bob had written an important piece in the American Psychologist about affect being primary. So many people up to that point had thought that to the extent that you feel emotion or affect, it follows from cognition. And he made the argument that affect actually comes first, that we feel emotion first and then thought follows from that. So we decided we were inspired to think about this possible design where we brought people into a lab. We had them look at a projection screen across the room. This was long before we could use laptops. And we gave them a slideshow of 12 pictures of a person doing everyday activities, sitting and reading a book, opening a car door, sitting in a coffee shop. And we just said, look at the pictures, form the impression of this person, and then answer some questions about the person. And what the participants didn't know is that we were inserting subliminal exposures to other images in between the slides. And for some people, they were seeing implicitly presented unpleasant images, so open heart surgery or skull and crossbones or a bucket full of snakes. And others in the positive condition, we're seeing couples hugging romantically, a beautiful nature scene. And so the finding that we produced was that the people who had been exposed to subliminal pleasant images thought that they would like the person they saw in the slides more. They thought the person had more attractive personality characteristics. Although, interestingly, the subliminal exposures didn't manipulate people's perceptions of that person's physical attractiveness. They had seen, 12 pictures, so they could make that judgment based on firsthand information. And so this was subliminal conditioning of attitudes, in short. So I presented that talk, and after my presentation, I kind of packed up and I left the room, and there were 5 colleagues who were there who wanted to tell me how deeply troubled they were about the ethics of what I had just done. That, how could I possibly have exposed people to stimuli that they weren't aware of, they didn't consent to, they weren't told in advance. And it just illustrated for me how when we live in the world of social psychology, that we take certain assumptions for granted, and that yet if we want our work to speak to the outside world, we got to be doing it in a way that not only is convincing to them, but it's got to be morally acceptable to them. And that was a huge wake-up call for me, and it made me think differently about everything I did after that. That every piece of work that I did, I needed to talk to a bigger audience, because I wanted to make sure that the people who were paying for our work, which was not the social psychologists, it was the taxpayers and other people, that they would find the work acceptable and interesting and important.
It strikes me, though, Jon, there's a little bit of cart before the horse, meaning you almost have to do that experiment to see any effect before you know there's any effect. Totally. Yeah. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Good.
I mean, yeah, you kind of have to make the mistake to learn from the mistake. That's kind of what it comes down to.
Yeah. And I think you get to be you, obviously. I wouldn't call it a mistake. I mean, it wasn't purposeful. It wasn't with intent. You were just following a research protocol that other of your social psychologists might have followed. And good for you for noticing or having other people help notice that, okay, maybe I need to think about what I'm doing here. I mean, you're exactly right. That's something we should all be doing with all of our research and with all of our teaching, for that matter. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
especially now.
So I want to dig a little bit more into your research, but I'm going to give you a scenario, and this isn't a test, by the way, and ask you about your professional opinion about this. So we have students at Boise State, and I'm sure you have students at Stanford that are passionate about what's going on today, whether it's politics, global warming, many of your specialty areas, and they'll do things like they'll organize a protest at the State House. We happen to be in the state capitol, and so students will organize this thing, and they'll do all this work to organize. And I've kind of always tried to keep it quiet to myself that those students probably aren't changing attitudes. I'm not so sure, and you can correct me, I'm not so sure a protest amongst your friends and colleagues at the State House changes anyone's attitudes, political attitudes, environmental attitudes, whatever. I guess I want to ask you, what do you think about that? And then based on your research and what you know about the field, how do you change political attitudes?
Okay, well, spectacular question, and let me answer it this way. I mentioned earlier that I had done 25 years of high-quality national surveys documenting public opinion on climate change, which is really psychologically very interesting, which we can talk about later. But in what I found in that work from early on was really startling, that even though I personally didn't even know what climate change was when I started doing that work, I was asked to do it. It wasn't a topic of interest to me. I quickly discovered that about 3/4 of Americans in 1997 already believed that the Earth was warming and that it was caused by humans and that it was going to be a problem. And so the country was way ahead of me on that issue in terms of understanding. I just hadn't paid any attention. And when 2010 came around, Barack Obama had been elected president in 2008. And remarkably, usually when Republicans and Democrats are fighting it out to become president, they agree on nothing. But in 2008, John McCain and Barack Obama agreed on pretty much everything about climate change. McCain had been a maverick in the Republican Party, and he said, as Obama did, climate change is real, it's caused by humans, it's a threat, government needs to do something about it. So maybe not surprisingly, in 2010 and 2011, the Congress got itself organized and put together some bills for representatives to vote on. And as the Senate vote was coming up, I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times that basically said, senators, in case you care, America is very much on the green side of this issue, you might call it, remarkably so. So if you end up voting for this bill, you should know that there'll be a lot of popular support for that decision. And so Stanford noticed that got published, and they said, oh, that's cool. Why don't we put you on a plane and we'll fly you to Washington and we'll make a bunch of appointments for you to talk to people in the Senate and the House of Representatives and tell them about your research. So I went and had a bunch of meetings with famous people and brought my little laptop and I showed them my slides. And pretty much they all said the same thing. Thank you for your time, Professor Krosnick. Very, very interesting work. Seems really valuable, but it's of no use to me. And I said, wait, why? And they said, well, because these are all national surveys and I represent Michigan or I represent the 3rd District of Michigan. And I think the people that I'm responsible for, my constituents, don't feel the same way that you're describing the country feels. And so I said, oh, wow, okay, well, that's interesting. I'd love to see the surveys that you've looked at to learn that. Oh, we don't have any surveys. Well, how do you know? Well, the way we know is the letters that we get, the emails that we get, the phone calls that we get, the screaming at me at the town hall meetings, and the protests at the State House. And so What's interesting is grassroots activism, even by relatively small numbers of people compared to the overall electorate that they have responsibility for, speak loudly to those representatives. And maybe they overgeneralize them. They don't have the budget to do surveys of their own in their districts. And this is kind of the only signal they get. And so when you can easily talk to staffers in the Senate and the House of Representatives in Washington, they all have people who answer phones. They all have people who open mail. And they don't just answer the phone and open the mail. They keep a tally of who says what, and that gets put in front of the representative. So I would say your students going to the State House were not necessarily there to change minds as much as to illustrate their own passion in a way that, it's harder for representatives to trivialize. It's harder for representatives to ignore. Now, I can answer your other question about how could people change minds, and I'll say just as a preliminary note, there have been hundreds of millions of dollars spent over the last 2 decades trying to change minds in America on climate change. If you look at journals like Nature Climate Change, you can see lots of experiments that have been published by social scientists trying to change people's opinions on on climate change. Mostly they don't work. They have small effects. The effects don't last very long. That people's opinions are not easily changed in a way that our laboratory experiments can change undergraduates' opinions in labs briefly. The tradition of attitude change research in the field, in fact, is bringing students into a lab, having them read or listen to a message, measuring their opinions afterwards, and then sending them off on their merry way and never following up to find out what happens. And superstar Bob Cialdini is the person who coined the term elastic opinion change, I believe, to describe the fact that in the few studies when we do go back to those people to see how do they feel a week or a month later, they are back to where they were before they came to the lab. So opinion change is really hard to do. And I'll just give you an example that, for a long time, political activist campaign professionals thought that if I'm going to help you win the next election, that there are a bunch of people who are going to vote and a bunch of people who are not going to vote. That's a decision that's made separately from who the candidates are or what happens in the campaign. So we want to focus among the people who are going to vote, and we want to convince them to like you. That has completely flipped now. The professionals have come to realize that it's very hard to get people to flip loyalties between candidates. And what matters much more is activating people who might or might not vote to vote. And so if you can identify the people who will vote for your candidate, but who may not vote at all, and you can inspire them to turn out, that is actually more doable and the more fruitful. So it's changing behavior more so than changing opinions in that case.
Interesting. Thank you for that. Jon, you study a lot of really important, timely topics that are going on in our culture right now. Is there anything that you're hopeful about?
Oh, I am absolutely certain.
And I'm not trying to project that you're not hopeful. I'm just, you study really complicated topics that our culture struggles with. And I was just curious about what are you hopeful about?
Yeah. I appreciate the invitation because I am a pathologically optimistic person. And I realize that, that has maybe some drawbacks in life. But, the fact of the matter is that Nazi Germany ended and many other phases of life that were really unpleasant. And everything is a phase. Everything will pass. And I think many people share the view that we are in the darkest of times in a way at the moment. And I'm fully confident this will pass. And, watching presidential approval ratings going down, I think this next election there's every reason to believe that the powerful impact that has occurred on people living their own lives comfortably, from gasoline prices to everything else, as well as the symbolic actions that we've all been watching. I think the data tell me that there's a very good chance the Congress will turn over in this next election, assuming that the election is held fairly. And so I am hopeful about that. And we got news, very distressing news, a week or so ago that the president's new budget is proposing to shut down all social, behavioral, and economic sciences at the National Science Foundation. And I'm optimistic about that too. I mean, that presidents can only advise Congress. Congress gives the money to NSF, and Congress has ignored presidents many times and has shown support for the National Science Foundation. So I'm not even distressed about that at this point. I think that there's just too much value in what we do, and it's now just take COVID as an example. That there were really, once COVID hit, there were really two issues involved. One was on the vaccine side. Could something be done to protect people from the little bugs that were getting us? But secondly, there was the human behavior side of it at so many different levels. And that illustrated very powerfully, the federal government put a huge amount of money in that first Trump administration into social and behavioral sciences because it was inevitably obvious. Here we are at war. There are lots of social and behavioral scientists who are involved in the military, who are involved in advising on these kinds of issues. So you can't deny, and I don't think the sensible people do, that we need the social and behavioral sciences. And I'm confident that we may go through phases, but we will get back to that point of
as a lifelong pessimist, it's really refreshing to hear what an optimist thinks. So thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
You get to take pride in predicting some bad stuff, I suppose.
Well, and the funny thing is, in my head, and I didn't want to interrupt you again, in my head, I thought you said, when there's the next election, and I thought to myself, really, you think there's going to be a next election? So I'm glad to have the optimist shine through in this conversation. So I know we're coming up on time. I want to be respectful of that. I can tell you right now, Jon, I hope I can invite you back for a part 2 sometime. But I want to circle back to, actually, I have 2 things. Tell me about your work with the U.S. Census Bureau, because I'm not a survey researcher like you are, but I have done survey research. I've done consulting. I've done some gigs here locally. I teach survey design, but I don't have your expertise. But when I saw that you'd done some stuff with the U.S. Census Bureau, I knew I had to ask.
Well, thank you. I think most people in America don't pay a lot of attention to the Census Bureau. I certainly didn't for a long time. I didn't know what they did or why it was important, other than every 10 years they try to count everybody. And even what was done with that, I didn't even know. But the fact of the matter is the Census Bureau is a huge operation doing lots of surveys throughout the years. The current population survey is done every month, and that's where the country's unemployment rate comes from. It comes from surveys. There are surveys the Census Bureau does to generate the inflation rate. So many of the most important statistics that drive the economy in the country and they get used by decision makers come from those surveys. There's the American Community Survey, the National Health Interview Survey, many others that the Census Bureau is involved in. And the Center for Behavioral Science Methods that I'm a part of as a research psychologist is one of the units there that is kind of the methodologists to try to help everybody else make sure that they're using best practices. And so just to give you an example, at some point I was co-principal investigator of the American National Election Study, which is a study that has tradition going back to 1948 when it started in Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan. It's now co-run by Michigan and Stanford. And this has been every 2 years for a long time now. It's every 4 years. Huge, very expensive $10 million survey work to produce data on voter decision making that become available free to any investigator who wants to use them. And when we took over and started looking at what could we improve, we realized that the interviews began by an interviewer knocking on the door of a household selected randomly from a list of all addresses in the country and figuring out which adults live there and randomly selecting one of those adults and only interviewing that one person. And I thought, when I looked at the script, which frankly I had never paid any attention to, about how did those interviewers on the doorstep figure out who the eligible people were, I thought this doesn't make any sense. This is a terrible script. Let me look at what the Census Bureau does, and we'll model an improved approach based on that. So I looked at the American Community Survey, and I looked at the decennial census, and I looked at the current population survey, and what I discovered was they didn't even do it the same way as each other did it. There was no agreement among them, and they had, not only did they have disagreeing protocols across the different studies, but even some of the studies had inconsistent results within study. So that this instruction said something, and then there was like an FAQ, frequently asked question answer, that the interviewer could give that contradicted the instruction that they gave everybody. So I just thought, okay, this is a major problem. So I called attention to that, and CBSM embraced that, and so there is now a project going to try to straighten out how to select randomly somebody from among the residents of a household. And you might think, well, that sounds pretty mechanical, not very psychological. That's entirely wrong. It's all psychological. The issue is, how do you decide, what are the criteria for deciding who lives here and helping an informant or a respondent who happens to answer the door think that through in an accurate way. And so anyway, that's an example, but what we are basically helping the building do all of its data collection optimally.
Yeah, that is fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. I want to give you a chance to talk about anything that you want at the very end, but can I circle back to jazz drummer? Can you say a little bit about that, please?
Well, as a kid, it was clear in my household that taking school seriously was important. But my mother was a passionate opera fan and felt music was very important. And so my sister and I ended up spending summers in northern Michigan at the National Music Camp at Interlochen, Michigan, which is a world-renowned summer camp. There are various others that have produced. Tanglewood is another one in Massachusetts that have produced lots of great musicians. And I went there starting when I was age 9, and I was there for 10 summers. These were 8-week summers for 10 years. And over that time being there, I became a really serious classical and jazz percussionist. The peak of my classical career was playing as a concerto soloist with the Philadelphia Orchestra, and I continued to do classical music. I think that's the reason I got into Harvard was that I was not in the classroom. I was nobody extraordinary, but I had this parallel musical career, and so I ended up playing classical music up in Boston. Although I ended up gravitating to the MIT Symphony rather than the Harvard Symphony because the MIT Symphony was bigger and had better percussion instruments. And but I also started to play jazz at Interlochen and then continued in college. And when I got to grad school, I let go of the classical stuff and just focused in on jazz. And I just can't seem to let it go. I really love it as an avocation, as well as, listening to the music and following the musicians, but also as a player. And so I created a group called Charged Particles in Columbus. And we are now in our 33rd year of making music. And that was following being a part of a group that was created in Ann Arbor while I was in grad school, a 9-piece Latin jazz group called the Lunar Octet. We had a little trouble with numbers there since there were 9 of us eventually. But those two groups are still going. The Lunar Octet is in its 45th year, I think. Both groups have put records out. Both groups have toured the world. I do about 200 concerts a year when you put the two bands together. And we've got both bands have new records that we're just finishing now that will come out soon. And so I hope your listeners will check out chargedparticles.com and lunaroctet.com. And, I think for students especially, it's an illustration that you can have a life. I mean, I think we saw many grad students come through PhD programs who said, I don't want to be a professor like you guys are because I want to have a life outside of being a professor. And, many of my colleagues, lived the life. My wife, also a professor, likes to say, the great thing about being a tenured professor is that you can work as much as you want as long as you work all the time. That's great. So, the key to for my happiness is going back and forth between those two lives. And I think it's an illustration that can happen.
Did you say 200 performances a year?
200 a year.
Still to this day?
Still to this day.
And you're traveling for many of those, right? If not most?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the last gig we did was literally 3 minutes from my house, but in general, we're driving hours or flying to next month, we're going to Los Angeles for 3 gigs in a row. Now, admittedly, that's a part of a conference. So there's the American Association for Public Opinion Research conference is happening. They invited the band to come play at the conference, and then the band is then doing 2 other jazz club gigs in addition to that down in LA. So I can kind of combine things together.
That is amazing. Jon, I know we're just about at time. I just wanted to try to give you the last word. You're thinking about our conversation today. Is there anything that you said to yourself, I want to make sure I mention X? And maybe we haven't gotten to it yet. I'm giving you the chance now to solve for X.
Well, I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk with you. It's fun to have the conversation, and I frankly would love to come back, and because we really didn't even get a chance to talk about the depth of many of the research issues that we could talk about. And I do think this is a really critical time for psychology and especially social psychology. Many people probably realize that last week or 2 weeks ago was was the publication of a new gigantic effort by Brian Nosek to look at replicability, showing the same low rates of replicability that he had shown many years before. There are real issues in the field about how we do our work and being realistic about what our findings are and not overclaiming, and in many other ways. I would love to have time to talk all that stuff through with you, because I think it would be maybe helpful for your listeners to have some perspective and but also to talk about what a privilege it is for me to have just kind of been doing my work and then have the phone ring and be invited to testify before Congress, or to have the phone ring and invite me to testify as an expert in a lawsuit. I mean, those are things that I would have wished for as a young scholar, and happily they occurred. And so I'm happy to talk about those stories if the time comes.
We will make the time. And Jon, thanks again for your time today, and thanks for sharing parts of your personal life, your professional life. I really appreciate it.
And thank you, Eric, for everything you guys are doing with this series. It's fabulous, and more power to you. May you continue.
Great. Thank you so much.
Hey everyone, Garth here. Thanks for listening to Psych Sessions. If you could go to wherever you listen to our podcast and you would follow that podcast or like it, it really does help us as we are trying to get out to more teachers of psychology. Also, if you haven't checked out our website, please visit psychsessions.org and sign up for our monthly newsletter. We offer free resources and valuable news that you are going to want to know related to the teaching of psychology. Thanks.